So, Michael, I've been reading Proust with my seniors, Volume 1, Swann's Way, and I came across a passage that I think will interest you very much. So, it occurs rather early in the book. It's just 2 sentences, not very long, given what Proust is capable of. So it's when we're meeting the characters and getting to know them, okay? And we hear this about the main character, Swann. Even with respect to the most insignificant things in life, none of us constitutes a material whole. Even the very simple act that we call seeing a person we know is in part an intellectual one. We fill in the physical appearance of the individual we see with all the notions we have about him, and of the total picture that we form for ourselves, these notions certainly occupy the greater part. So you were telling me just the other day that what I just read from Proust is something that Euclid can prove.
Yeah.
That I want to see.
All right. So the Euclid in his Optics, of course, is writing a geometrical treatment of human vision, not color,
Okay.
but just the size, shape, and clarity of the things that we see.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Optics begins with a set of definitions about, or presuppositions about the nature of our power of sight. And it begins with a claim that what we see occurs along straight lines, or that the power of our vision occurs along straight lines that extend a great greatness into space, all the way to the point, for instance, that we can see stars.
Okay. So he's saying that about just the power of vision, not about light.
Not about light. And he's really not saying, for instance, that light is the source of our sight.
Okay.
And probably the simplest way to think about that is light that strikes the back of our head doesn't make us see anything.
Mm-hmm.
But some power that extends in straight lines from our eyes. And I think a lot of readers of the Optics, there haven't been a lot of readers of the Optics recently, but a lot of readers of Euclid's Optics understand what Euclid is saying is to say that some kind of power emanates outward from our eyes into the world. I don't think that's of material importance in terms of reading Euclid's Optics and thinking about what he's showing us about sight, but that is one way people understand it. A few other things that he actually says in these definitions is that the size of an object, at least the size that it appears to be for our sight, is dependent upon the angle that the extremities of the object make with our eye. So if you draw straight lines from our eye to the ends of any object we're looking at, that would be its front surface that's available to us because we can't see around to the back, that angle that it makes determines the size that things appear.
Okay.
So, when somebody is far away, you can situate their head between your fingers and crush their head if you want, or something like that, at least in appearances. So that's sort of the beginning of the rules of sight, is that sight operates along straight lines. What those straight lines touch, we see, and what they don't touch, we don't see.
Okay.
So the very first...
I can accept that.
Yeah.
Okay. As a starting point.
The very first proposition, then, the one that you've asked me to show that Euclid proves, is that we never see any object in its entirety all at once, at the same time. He says hama in Greek.
Okay.
So if I considered an object to be just the side of it that's facing me, is what Euclid's talking about, this line BC is the object I'm looking at.
That line, all right.
And A is where my eye is. Then many lines of vision, or of the power of my vision in straight lines, come out from my eye, or can be drawn out from my eye, and they touch this object BC.
Mm-hmm.
And where they touch it, I see a part of the object.
In this case, a point.
A point, yes. Because these lines are straight, and because they come from one point, my eye,
And diverge.
They diverge. Well, if they didn't diverge, they'd just see one point.
Yeah.
Right. So in order to see many points, the power of vision must diverge. But because it diverges, there are gaps or spaces in between the lines that define the power of vision.
Okay.
And anything that falls in those spaces, we don't see. So this is a picture of one moment in time of the power of our vision operating on one object and seeing parts of it and missing or not seeing the parts in between.
Missing most of it.
Well, maybe.
It looks like.
Yeah, right. It depends on how many lines of vision there are.
Well, that's what I wanted to, that's in a way the obvious question, isn't it? Why not just draw more lines, indefinitely more lines?
I think as many as you draw, right, they still diverge from one another. So as long as you maintain the thought that the power of vision operates along straight lines, and that what you see comes into focus at one place, one point, your eye.
Your eye. Mm-hmm.
Then there'll be parts that are missed.
Okay.
Right? So at one moment in time, you never encounter the entirety of the thing you're looking at.
Even a very small thing that's close.
Sure.
Okay.
Actually, I think the next proofs that Euclid does in the optics indicate that if this body BC were to be closer, it would be touched by more lines, or there would be fewer gaps in between the powers of vision, and we would see it more clearly.
More clearly.
But not in its entirety at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one thing that seems really remarkable to me about that first proof is not the math itself, which I think is pretty straightforward once you accept the definitions.
It's so simple. And the implications seem so big that it's startling.
Well, and I thought it's startling, surely, just to say, when we begin from perception itself, by itself, we don't get continuous wholes. That's not our experience. Mm-hmm. That's not derived from just vision. But Euclid adds one line of text to the end of his first proposition, and it's not a mathematical comment. It's a comment about our opinions and the way things seem to us. And he says, despite this fact that we don't see something in its entirety all at once, he says, it seems to us that we do, because our eyes flicker back and forth, and he's indicating some holding together of a series of moments, putting together a number of these experiences that are missing things, and giving ourselves the impression, the opinion, that we do see wholes all at once, and that the scene that's held together is one moment in time, and that the object itself is given to us by our vision.
I see. So the eye might have little movements in itself, or the head, and this takes a certain amount of time. And it sounds like this is almost like an integration operation, where here a certain distance BC is the points thereon are integrated to give you a continuous line. Just to use the language of calculus.
No, I think it might approximate the thought of the calculus in some ways, this thought, except for the very next propositions, like I was saying before, are propositions about variable clarity. So even though there's maybe some flickering of the eyes, which I think human beings who study these things have discovered this several times in history, including Charles Darwin's father studied this. Even though there's that flickering, and even though Euclid is saying we're taking many snapshots from our vision and putting them together as if they were one thing, even that doesn't give us everything. Mm-hmm. So that the next propositions indicate, not that an object that's closer to us is seen in its entirety over a period of time, but that it's seen with more clarity than the same object farther away. Mm-hmm. Not perfect clarity, but more clarity. Which also means something is being thrown into the mix, which isn't just given to us by our eyes and then collected by our soul. That's what
interests me. So with Proust, you're talking about what it takes to know another human being, or to make known a character in a book. It takes many pages, many interactions with many people as one follows him along, and even then, you feel that character is a mystery. Finally, so does that have some counterpart in Euclidean optics? What I just described, humanly.
Well, I think the mystery might be, what do we have to add? Since no matter, well, I maybe I'd say this: if we wait too long, we take too long of a period, it won't seem like a single vision to us, right? So staring and moving your head over and scanning something, that wouldn't seem like it was one thing, one experience. But if we just focus on those experiences that seem to us as if they're one, there's still something added in there that isn't just all the things that our powers of vision have touched. There's something that we're putting in that blurs together with the things that we have in fact seen.
Yeah. So Proust, in what I read, said we have intellectual notions that we're adding. In this case, they're prejudices that the family has about the bourgeois background of this main character. So they think of him in a certain kind of class.
Right.
He's that kind of person. So does that get at what you mean, that we're adding to this line certain intellectual notions that make it a line, a straight line, rather than some other kind of mathematical object?
Well, if I move away from the line slightly, it does seem to me the word prejudice is a pretty good word. There's a judgment that's being made before any experience, before perception has given us anything. There's a judgment that's being made that seems to explain what we put in to complete the whole and give us the appearance, or the opinion, I should say, that we have encountered a whole. And probably those things that we put in have to be somewhat class specific, right?
Yeah.
So if I think I'm looking at a straight line, I put in some kind of simulacrum of straightness in between the actual parts that I've seen to straighten it out for the whole. If I thought I was seeing something else, I'd put in things that belong to its kind. But those things that are put in are not as vivid, I think, at least in vision, so that explains why the things that are farther away are still blurrier for us or less clear.
And where do those things come from
Yeah.
that we're putting in or filling in the gaps, as it were? Literally here, filling in gaps.
Filling in gaps, yeah.
Where does it come from? Do we make it up? Is it a habit? Is it something, to go back to the word prejudice, pre-existing that we simply apply, that's common to all minds?
Yeah, I would think that there probably are options, if I could put it that way, that we're not simply predetermined by structures that are born into us. I think in the context you began us in Swann's way, it doesn't seem to me that those notions of class are inborn. And since they wouldn't be applied to every unfamiliar human being, they aren't necessitated by the experience, but they're imposed upon it. I would think that's also true even of some of our geometric approaches. Depending upon what we already have come to think about objects, how we're vaguely familiar with them, what we expect from them, we put into them.
So, but that sounds pretty radical.
Yeah. So there's I just mentioned a late proof in Euclid's Optics. Early on, Euclid shows that if you look at an object and it's moving toward you, if you look at the same object at two different distances, which is a way in which you could model movement, that same object seen closer will occupy a larger angle of your vision, and so it will look bigger to you.
Yep.
So he proves that. It basically just draws that same line BC closer and then connects the endpoints to show that it occupies a larger angle.
A larger angle at A. Yep.
Okay, so that's what it means geometrically for something to look bigger to us. Late in the book, Euclid has a small proof where the diagram would be just exactly the same. But he says, if there's an object that's growing, it's actually changing size and getting larger, we will think it's coming at us. That is, we will think it's coming at us. And why does he say something like that? That's not math. The math is indifferent. The same appearance occurs whether there's something coming at us and seeming to get bigger that way by occupying larger angles of our vision, as would appear if something were not approaching us at all, but just getting bigger and occupying larger angles in our vision. So he says we will think it's coming at us because it matters to us if something's coming at us.
If it's big enough and coming at me, it might eat me.
There it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even the simplest thing, that baseball is coming at me, right? And it's going to hit me.
So what you just described about things getting bigger, either because they're coming at us or they're simply increasing in size while remaining at rest, interests me a lot because it sort of involves character in seeing things, even just things as mathematical objects. It involves, say, courage and cowardice, or things like that, virtues and vices. But I thought those things ought not to enter into doing Euclidean optics or Euclidean geometry or objective science, physics. But in a way, you're saying it's there.
Well, it's certainly there in Euclid's text. I would probably begin by suggesting some of these kinds of comments that Euclid makes are extra mathematical, that they're outside the realm of what's mathematically necessary or mathematically relevant. In other words, the object that's growing has the same logos for vision that the object that's coming at us has. It's increasing in size, occupying a bigger angle. Now, in I think every proof in Euclid's Optics, there's basically two accounts. There's the account of how things appear to our vision. And then there's the account of where they are in linear geometrical relationships to one another, where our eye is, how far away the object is, what its size is. And those two accounts, or two logoi, are separate from one another. And there's even a proof in the middle of Euclid's Optics to indicate that they never quite exactly have the same proportions. So he's always telling two stories, how things look and then how they are. And then he seems to throw in a third story from time to time, what we think about them, how our mind relates to these situations.
Or how to reconcile
the
fact that they don't simply overlap,
the
two logoi. Yeah, this question often comes up when we're doing freshman math and freshmen are working through Euclid's geometry. What does this have to do with the so-called real world? Is this geometry that we're doing real? Is it out there in nature?
So there's seemed to be a really funny or interesting set of understandings the way Euclid presents the optics. For instance, objects really have size that belongs to them, and they really are a certain place and at a certain time, and their dimensions could be explained or described the way Euclid describes the boundaries of objects in the elements. That is, they have places where they end and places where other things start. All that I think Euclid treats as the world outside of us. Not only that, but those boundaries and those objects are whole, and they are continuous.
And stable.
And stable. He treats them as stable. Our vision doesn't show that.
Okay.
Our vision doesn't show us all of them at once, not even the side that's facing us. And it's not unchanging, because if our eye moves or the object moves and changes its relationship, its size and even its shape and its clarity, how clearly we see it, all those things change. So that's what vision initially gives us. Yeah. Euclid presents it as if we should think that's explained by a stable, consistent, continuous, and world full of holes.
So Euclid he assumes or prejudges there is this real, stable whole that is behind the appearances geometry gives us, laws about it.
Yeah. I think that is the set of his assumptions, yeah.
So if this isn't too preposterous, why should one believe the geometry rather than the eye, what one's eyes give you?
I'm not sure that I have a completely good answer to that question. Except, I can tell you, I think, what is a difference between the two.
Okay.
Well, I think we've already mentioned in a certain way, the world is stable. If we just paid attention to what vision gives us, just vision by itself, the sizes of things change all the time on the basis of our situation to them.
Of course.
Right? We tend to think as we're approaching something and it gets bigger in our vision that it's not growing. Right? But how do we test that? We go up to it maybe and we measure it, we touch it to see if it is where we see it as being, things like that. But that's no test if the world could have been changing. That is, by the time I get up to somebody, maybe they've grown. And when I leave them, they shrink. And all these things, when I move, they seem to move. Aspects of relative motion. Why couldn't that be the sort of dynamic and ever-changing way in which the world really is? And we suppose that underneath that there is something stable and consistent.
So this would get at that third story that you were saying you could tell us. That is, what do we think about, the choice or the discrepancy between the two logoi, geometry and perception? And as we think about it, maybe we would find ourselves more amenable to going with the eye under certain scenarios. Let me give you one, another literary one that comes to mind. It's from Hamlet. Okay, so that's when the ghost returns to visit Hamlet while he's talking with his mother, Gertrude. And Hamlet sees the ghost. Gertrude doesn't. And Hamlet says, "Don't you see my father dressed in his habit as he lived?" And she says, "I see nothing there." And he says, "Nothing at all?" And she says, this is the interesting part, "Nothing at all, and all that is, I see." So she's not only not seeing the ghost for whatever interesting reason, but she's operating under this assumption that her eyes give her the world. Give her what is there. And Hamlet knows differently. That is, so if one goes with one's eyes, it looks like it can go both ways. You can see ghosts. Or like Hamlet, or you, like Gertrude, could say, there aren't any, because I don't see them. I never have. But that makes all the difference in the world of that play.
Well, I imagine, how would I say it, a more modest Gertrude, and I don't mean that in any punning way, who wouldn't simply trust her own vision, who would accept, for instance, that maybe the logic of ghosts means they appear to some and not to others.
Or maybe
or that Hamlet sees rightly.
Maybe they're in here.
Right.
They occupy a certain gap in one's perception, one's character, one's intellect.
Well, yeah. So there's two things. There's the gap that attends each of our perceivings, so that each of us humbly, I think, should recognize is missing something of what is there which could be seen. So there's a world that could be visible and is not visible to anyone in its entirety. So each of us are missing some of that. And we could be humble about what we're missing. And if someone else tells us they see something there that we don't, we could possibly consider maybe within the gaps they're seeing something that is there to be seen. The other thing, I think, is the filler, what we add in, what we put in that's not gotten by vision at all, but from our starting points. We could call them our prejudices, I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned a word a couple of times that interests me. It goes back in a way to character, humility.
Yeah.
That this proof should make us more humble about who we are as knowers, learners? What are the implications of that?
It might be several, but if you think just narrowly with regard to our relationship to math to begin with, right? There's a lot of, I think, tendency, especially amongst modern students, to think that math is about things that human beings made up. And therefore, in a way, it's subject to our whim. Mm-hmm. We are masters of math because we made it, and it does what we say it does, and nothing more. This suggests that math in some way exceeds us, and we fail at grasping it entirely. We don't get to the holes that are there. Instead, we substitute holes of our own making.
You mean the mathematical beings?
Yeah.
If we can call them that. We don't, they're there, and we don't get them.
Yeah, so one of the ways in which I think a lot of people describe the mathematical beings is that they are abstracted from our experiences, meaning they are some kind of dimmed down, cut away version of what we experience. So we never experience things with clean lines, right, for instance, although I suspect we actually do experience things with actual boundaries. But still, there's a sense in which the math is cleaner, purer, simpler than what we experience. And that leads to the thought that we have abstracted it away from our experience. And by experience, I think that means our sensation. This suggests our sensation falls short of the thing it's sensing, which is ascribed by Euclid as having those, one could say, perfect mathematical properties: continuity, fullness, wholeness. We don't get that from our perceptions. Instead, we make up something that seems to us to be whole. Mm-hmm. And in the way we make it up, with its blurriness especially, we throw in things that aren't really there, that come from us, and maybe come from very suspect sources. So we aren't masters of this math. We are falling short of it continually, and we're adulterating it with the things that we throw in.
Okay, so you just used another word that I think goes with humility. This proof might, offer the lesson that we are just naturally going to experience the world in a blurry way. We're blurred, and we should live. And the effort to see things clearly, which Descartes makes such a big part of his program. That's prideful, and it involves, or maybe it's just creative. So it's an invitation to create and to make up for the deficiency, great clarity. Sure. But what is it an option to say, I want to live my natural blurry life? I mean, there's something to be said. Is there something to be said for blurriness?
I think it sounds right to me that there's something to be said for blurriness, because it's, how do I say it? It's in measure with the way sensation gives us the world. But of course, we're not just sensing beings. As you said, I think the other option is not, that we would clean up our blurriness into perfect clarity. That just doesn't seem to be an option, at least in the terms of this sort of proof. But the option is that we could possibly find clarity in a different aspect of our being than in our sensation.
And what would that be? You mean intellect?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it would have to be intellect that is, constituting the clarity or discovering clarity in some realm that isn't composed of our perceptions. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Could one also say, I was thinking about this a moment ago, that there's an invitation here to become more than we ever thought possible creators. Mm-hmm. That is, if even in giving ourselves a line, we're doing something creative that we may not understand or be aware of, then that opens the door towards a way of thinking about ourselves and a way of experiencing life that is quite exciting.
I think there's a variety of things that follow along the lines I think you're suggesting. One, a possibility of being active without apology is available. if we say there is no circumstance in which we experience the world, in which we aren't active composers in some measure, then it seems to me we don't have to apologize or denigrate our own efforts when we are in fact active constructors of the experience. That might also invite us to think, how could we add to the composition of our own experience in such a way as to make it better? It depends upon what the sources are of what we're adding in. And if those sources are changeable, then we could very well pursue lines of thought that indicate, let's find better things to add in. Let's genuinely make a better world, because we have no option to be anything other than world makers. And our only options really turn out to be whether we become relatively inactive, unconscious makers of bad worlds, or whether we try to seize upon that power itself and steer it in directions that rather gratify us and satisfy us better.
Okay, so two things occur to me there. And if we go back to our line, so we've got endpoints, B and C. We've got a limit, therefore. Our eye gives us that much at least.
Yeah.
So does that mean that if we're going to really take to heart this invitation to remake the world, that there are limits, there are endpoints given to us in our very perception?
Yeah, so I mean, we could say that the power of our vision gives us certain limits in terms of perceiving things. And the objects themselves, the things that are out there that are capable of being seen, impose limits. But within those limits, there's quite a lot of possibility for a difference in the quality of our own creative contributions. And I don't know, it depends a little bit on what and how we fill things in as to whether or not we could extend something beyond the endpoints.
But one can sense already how this becomes, a moral question.
Well, very much so. But, there was another moral question involved in the way things appear to us that we touched on a little earlier, but I just call attention to it right now. Is there a moral stance in preferring a stable world, a consistent world, to one that's very, very changeable? Right? Is there a moral predilection to prefer being and rest and lack of change over change?
Yeah. Preferring Euclid's stationary geometry.
Yeah.
So beautiful, so intact, to something that's in motion.
Well, the geometry of Euclid's of the optics,
this
right?
geometry, yeah.
So the underlying geometry, which maybe explains what we see, is stable, consistent, unmoving, unchanging things for the most part. Sometimes they grow. And what we see is a whole series of changes depending upon the different relationships of our eye to the objects. And so if we want to ask ourselves, what is the baseline starting point upon which we can create the worlds that we prefer or inhabit the worlds that we prefer? Vision gives us dynamic changes that we could very well live with. We could say, when you're far away, you're small, right? And when I get closer to you, you're big. And we could live in that world where there isn't this notion that each of us has an absolute measure.
Yeah, that has implications for equality.
I think,
and politics,
quite
and
very,
everything.
All of our spatial temporal metaphors that we apply to human moral relations would assume less fixity. And would also, I think, be understood to be dependent upon context much more clearly.
Well, here's another implication that occurs to me about this discovery or proof that we don't get things whole in vision. What if we were to go with that, say, as readers of books? Why read the whole? Why not read the parts that are useful to us and not worry about the rest? Why do we need to get the whole person, say, in our relationships with people? There's something about this person that I want to know and make use of. The rest does not concern me. I mean, approaching things that way, that is embracing the discreteness of life rather than trying to get at wholeness all the time. I mean, what do you see when you think about it that way?
Well, in a certain way, I see an admirable clarity, how would I put it? A person who wants to live life centered around the things that matter to them and not to waste their life and their time dealing with things that have no use or meaning to them. On the other hand, one wonders how they come to know what else is on the page that they're ignoring.
That they're ignoring, yeah.
Yeah.
That's yeah. How would they
So
know?
in a loose way, I guess I understand this sort of thing, that one reads every word on the page, but maybe only focuses attention and interest on a few words on the page. That would suggest that you saw everything, but you focused only on moments of particular interest or importance. And that seems to me maybe reliable. On the other hand, if you wanted to be really creative, why let authors impose themselves on you?
Yeah.
On the other, now it seems to me if you make any use of any other author, you maybe understand their effect on you to be inspirational rather than communication or something like this. You're not taking the message they're sending. You're taking something that they've offered as a occasion and a provocation for some working of your own.
Yeah.
And I really want to say, what is to criticize that? If the working, the making that you make of your own is fulfilling, and if it's a good thing. I often think when I read Martin Heidegger, for instance, and he writes about some other author, he's not getting it right.
Yeah.
He's not being faithful to the author he writes about. But I've seen moments in Heidegger where he basically, it seems to me, to admit that, or even to admit that it's not possible to get the other author right, to see them as they saw themselves. And then he defends his own action as saying, well, isn't what I wrote better? That is, what are you complaining about? You're saying I didn't give you a hamburger. I gave you a steak. That's not what you asked for. And then he wants to say, but it's better meal. And and I guess what would be the complaint if you inhabited a better series of thinking, a better vision, a better expression of human creativity? What would be the complaint? That it's not faithful to the original?
Yeah. Well, the example you give, hamburger and steak, suggests the criteria of better has something to do with health or liveliness or pleasure or...
Right. Well, yeah, I think why one thinks a steak dinner is better than a hamburger might quite vary depending upon how you're defining.
But I think,
the improvement.
There's something I wanted to get at with that question. So, because I'm intrigued by, this possibility of approaching life in its discreteness, choosing and leaving things out, even the reading of a book. I'm not so concerned with getting it all and getting it right. Because for one thing, going back to the limits, I'm mortal. I don't have the time.
Sure.
I've got to choose what to read, how much to read. And, but that does seem to imply I've got some notion of what's important to me, what it's for. Is it for health? Is it for inspiration? Is it for, I just want to maximize beautiful moments? Or I want something that will make me feel in the moment a kind of eclipse of other things?
There's this other, I think, lurking possibility that you want to understand the world, right? And you understand, you think there's something there, and I wish to see it and think it as it is, right? And that's where, an argument against someone like Heidegger might come forward and say, well, you're really not seeing that. And if you only pick out certain moments, you're distorting to some extent, and that means you're failing to understand.
But what's the attraction of seeing it, getting it as it is, rather than, or getting pieces of it and maybe filling in some gaps as I will, because I'm a creator.
Right. Well, I mean, it stands and falls on the sense in which one thinks seeing what is has some kind of absolute value, right? Regardless of its instrumental use or subjection to other purposes one might have in one's life. But I guess I think of...
Well, why not say seeing it as it is?
Yeah.
As long as that as it is as stable as it is, then the gain is some participation in immortality. And that's what everyone wants.
Right. No, I think that would follow if the things as they are eternal.
Yeah, stable.
Right. Well, but there might be things that are, how would I say, relatively stable that aren't always.
That are not eternal.
Yeah. For instance, I think Aristotle tends to characterize nature as that which is always, or for the most part.
Okay.
And I actually think in the analysis of these things, he finds few things that are always, if any. But then what he's calling nature is for the most part, meaning we might, even in all our understanding of the world, inhabit a moment that's an exception, and maybe fire won't burn the same way in Persia 10,000 years from now, or 100,000 years from now, or there'll be no Persia. So that sort of thing just presupposes, I think, if it's going to be participation in immortality of sorts, it's going to be so because the objects are eternal. Now,
but I could also see this going in a speaking of health, in another direction. I mean, what implications does this proof have that we don't get things whole, and we have to fill in? For the question of, say, sanity versus madness. People think Hamlet's mad because, he sees ghosts and he's trying to act on that vision, and it makes him behave very strangely.
I think within the sort of option I think that you mentioned regarding Hamlet, that maybe we could understand Hamlet as just someone who sees some of the gaps that other people miss. That certainly wouldn't constitute a mental defect if insanity is a defective condition. And it wouldn't constitute, one of the ways in which people often speak about insanity. It wouldn't mean seeing things that aren't there. But the filling in part seems to be some kind of seeing things that aren't there for our power of vision, or aren't being revealed by our power of vision. So the filling in is, how would I say it? It's a symptom of the being's prior apparatus, whatever they have to fill in with. And that really might testify to something like their character. And if you're given a series of hints about something, the conclusions that you draw from those hints depend on who you are to a great extent. If you looked at someone putting together a bunch of clues that are not themselves whole, the things that they fill in to link one to the other reveal to you the way they think and the way they approach the world and the assumptions that they make. So you can see this very often in people's interpretations of works that aren't telling you everything. Is what do they fill in? And that's from them. It's not from anywhere else. Now, how they got those things is probably not entirely all their own making or their own fault. But still, it tells you a lot about who they are, at least at the moment they make those interpretations.
Yeah, I was thinking also of madness in terms of not just, filling things in a way other people don't, but, seeing the same thing everywhere. An obsession, obsessional quality.
Well, I think in some way the filling in would tend to have this. This is almost what, if somebody has a relatively stable character, they tend to complete the world in relatively stable ways, or repeat. I think Nietzsche defines character as having a typical experience, this experiencing the world the same way again and again, because there's something integrated and stable about anybody who we would say have character. This is under the assumption that some of us don't have character, if I could put it that way.
Yeah. But that sounds like take to the extreme wanting the world to be stable and self-same.
Yeah.
That's madness. The same thing everywhere, always.
I think it would look that way, possibly if you encountered Zeno or Parmenides and those people who wanted to say nothing moves, nothing changes, all is one. All is one. So they have to talk with you about all the particulars in the world, but at the same time tell you that there aren't any such things, and that every place they are looks the same to them.
Yeah. Kind of madness of give me the whole and make it stable. Does this have implications, though, for, so vision proves to be incomplete. Why not fall back on other senses? Can we correct vision that way without, having to fill it in with intellectual notions that might be prejudices and have all sorts of other implications?
There might be limited ways. I mean, if you think about the ways in which we would try to correct the appearances vision gives us with our senses, I won't use a Euclidean example. I'll use one that occurs in Rousseau. So you look at a stick that is part in the air open and part in the water, and it seems to bend. You reach in your hand and you find that it doesn't bend. You feel along it to find that it doesn't bend. That has limited applications, right? We can't do those sorts of things with the stars or anything that's particularly far away. We can't do that with anything that's too big for our hands. And very often, maybe I'll make a joking, we can't do that with anything that's too far away in space-time. That is something that's farther away in space-time than light can travel between the distance where our hand is right now and where that object is. We can't touch, ever. No causal relationships between those sorts of things.
So the senses are not going to be self-correcting sufficiently to give us wholes.
Right. They don't all have the same issues that vision has, right? In the Euclidean presentation, vision has this limitation because it operates on straight lines. Maybe touch doesn't, right? Exactly. But it has other limitations, like contact. That's a very severe limitation, I would say. And that imposes temporal limitations. If you wanted to correct a vision at one point in time with a touch that you're going to make later, you really have to assume that nothing's changed in between, right? And I don't see how any other sense would fully justify the assumption.
So going back to the beginning in a way, Euclid writes the Elements, his book of geometry, and he writes the Optics. And those two logoi don't overlap. There's some kind of, incommensurability problem, because the world that we see is not the world of the elements of geometry. That seems like a problem. So how does one solve the problem? What are the options?
Well, I think there are probably lots of options, many of which don't really solve the problem, if I could put it that way.
Well, which one do you rank first?
I guess I want to say that though there are two logoi, they have a kind of contact that Euclid establishes in the Optics. So one could be very despondent, I think, to think that the world as I see it and from sensation, and the world that as I construct it in my opinions, neither of these worlds correspond to what is what is out there outside of us. That could lead to great despondency and even a pervasive sense that sort of the objects of my own lived experience aren't real things. And that would be corrosive. I mean, for instance, to think that your mother is not real, which I always use as an object if I'm trying to make an example, because it's an object we care about.
Yeah.
And it matters to us whether mother is real or not.
Yeah.
So we could think this, but there's a pathway in the optics, I think, between the two logoi. Euclid is showing how a certain situation that corresponds to the relations in linear distances and orientations of objects that are capable of being seen in the world can be understood as the cause of the precise appearances that we have, maybe not of the filler, but of the size, of the degree of clarity, of the location in our visual field, all those things. And even things like that anticipate Einstein, like relative motion, all those things can be understood to be the product of a stable world of geometrically perfect, continuous whole objects out there in space. The bridge to that world, which is not what we see or what is formed in our opinions exactly, is to engage in sort of backward reasoning. If I see this, what could the situation of the world out there be that would cause that vision?
One searches for causes that make sense of the appearances, sort of that old astronomical notion, save the appearances, with, in that case, circular geometry. But you're proposing that as really a kind of philosophy of life, or maybe our default position, that we are always looking for such causes to fill in the gaps. And
well, it makes sense, but it also seems to me one could really entertain, I think, the thought that we don't know what the underlying causes might be. In fact, there could be a variety of them. I think that's well illustrated in the proof we talked about earlier. An object that's changing its distance with respect to you appears to be getting bigger and in your eye, and an object that's changing its size but not approaching you also appears to be getting bigger. Either one could be the underlying experience. We could be going around the sun, or the sun could be going around us, and it gives us the same appearances. So recognizing that reasoning backward from our standpoint requires us to be, I think, cautious and provisional and open to new possibilities.
I like the idea of cause as playing a role in this, humanly speaking, because it makes me think of plot. That is, a line is a plot. You know, in literature, one speaks of plot lines.
Right.
You know, that's where Aristotle, a beginning, causing a middle, causing an end, and that's one causal line. So our lives have plots, but maybe they don't. Maybe it's all a bunch of discrete moments that are not connected. I mean, that would be a rather frightening thought.
Well, I think it might be, but it might also, I see some liberation in there too. I mean, if we're not held to the standard of connected, continuity and pristine sort of clarity and connection.
Then you can, if you're in a tragedy, you can get out.
Yes.
As Oedipus tries to do, though he doesn't succeed.
Something happens in Oedipus at Colonus that the audience doesn't see.
That's right.
And it's a secret kept by, the princes of Athens.
Oh, that's very nice.
Right?
Yeah, so it's hidden. So in those gaps are possibilities of hidden triumph, as in the case of Oedipus at Colonus, where he's elevated to a kind of divine or semi-divine status. That's very nice. Yeah, so one can go up or down with this, or around, many different ways.
So it does seem to me it shows how much we take this as our starting point, how much it affords us a revelation about how our path in life depends so much on our own attitude, and what one person regards as a disaster, another person can regard as an opportunity.